Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me okay at the back? Yeah? If the sound doesn't work for somebody, please let me know. So my subject is the use of ayahuasca in the healing of all manner of medical conditions, from cancer to addiction. And you might say, what can possibly a plant do to heal such dire and life-threatening medical problems? Of course, that all depends on the perspective through which we understand these problems. Now, the medical perspective, the allopathic Western medical perspective in which I was trained, is that fundamentally diseases are abnormalities that occur either due to external causes, such as a bacterium or a toxin, or they're accidental, or due to bad luck, or they're due to genetics. So basically the causes of illnesses are outside the usual internal experience, emotional and psychological and spiritual life of the individual. These are biological events, so the medical assumption goes, and the causes are to be understood and the treatments are to be administered purely in a biological fashion. Underlying that set of assumptions are two other assumptions. One is that you can separate the human body from the human mind, so what happens to us emotionally and psychologically has no significant impact on our health. Number one, and number two, that the individual is to be separated from the environment, so that what happens to me, if I get cancer, that's again just my pure personal misfortune, or maybe because I did the wrong things, like smoked cigarettes. But that my cancer may have something to do with the lifelong interaction in which I've engaged in with my environment, particularly the psychological social environment, that doesn't again enter into the picture. But what if we had a different perspective? What if we actually got that human beings are biopsychosocial creatures by nature, and I should say biopsychosocial spiritual creatures by nature, which to say that our biology is inseparable from our psychological, emotional, and spiritual existence. And therefore, what manifests in the body is not some isolated and unique event or misfortune, but a manifestation of what my life experience has been in interaction with my psychological and social and spiritual environment. Well, if we had that kind of understanding, then we would approach illness and health in a completely different fashion. What if furthermore we understood something in the West, which has been the underlying core insight of Eastern spiritual pathways and Aboriginal shamanic pathways around the world, which is that human beings are not their personalities, we're not our thoughts, we're not our emotions, we are not our dysfunctional or functional dynamics, but that at the core there is a true self that's somehow connected to, in fact not connected to, but part of nature and creation. And that illness, from that perspective, represents a loss of that connection, a loss of that unity, a loss of that belonging to a much larger entity. And that therefore to treat the illness or the symptom as the problem is to actually to ignore the real possibility that the symptom or the illness are themselves symptoms rather than the fundamental problems. So it's in that perspective then that I've come to understand, quite before my acquaintance with ayahuasca, but that's how I've come to understand human illness and dysfunction. Which is to say that illness and dysfunction represent the products or the consequences of a lifelong interaction with our environment, particularly our psychological and social environment, and that they represent a deep disconnection from our true selves. Now, I mentioned particularly cancer and addiction, but those are only two examples. Allow me to read you something from an article that appeared in last February's edition of Pediatrics, which is the major pediatric journal in North America. And this is an article from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, and it's called An Integrated Scientific Framework for Child Development. Here's what they say. Growing scientific evidence also demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. In other words, that the emotional and behavioral patterns that as young children we adapt or adopt in order to survive stresses in our environment allow us to deal with the immediate problem, but in the long term they become prisons, they become sources of dysfunction, illness, and even death if you're not able to let go of them. So, in other words, what was a short-term state, or meant to be a short-term state, in a helpful way, when it becomes a long-term trait, when it goes from state to a trait, now it becomes a problem. So, let me give you a few obvious examples of that. So, I myself have been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, a characteristic of which is tuning out, absent-mindedness. Now, ADD in North America is seen as a disease, and we see many more kids are being diagnosed with it, and now we have 3 million kids in this country who are on stimulant medications for it. The rates are going up and up and up. According to the New York Times last week, 20% of American boys at one point in time or another have been diagnosed with it, and 10% are at any one time are on medication. 3 million at least are on stimulants right now. It's seen as a genetic disease. It isn't at all. What the tuning out represents, as we all know, is actually a coping mechanism. Our brains tune out when the stress becomes overwhelming, too much to bear. And at that point, the tuning out is a survival dynamic. The real question is, why are so many kids tuning out? What's happening in their lives? And what's, of course, is going on is that the stress in this society and the stress in the parenting environment is greatly increasing. So the child's brain is actually affected by the stresses in the environment. And here's further from the same Harvard article. They talk about brain development and how the human brain actually develops. And here's what they say about that. The architecture of the brain is constructed through an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a sturdy or fragile foundation for all the health, learning, and behavior that follow. So in other words, the architecture of the human brain is actually constructed by the interaction with the environment. And they continue. The interaction of genes and experiences literally shapes the circuitry of the developing brain and is critically influenced by the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships, particularly in the early childhood years. Well, I can't make this into a lecture on brain development, but the point is that which circuits in the brain develop and which patterns are ingrained has everything to do with the early environment, particularly the mutual responsiveness of adult-child relationships. And therefore, whatever interferes with that mutual responsiveness will actually interfere with the brain development of the child, including the neurochemistry of the child's brain, as well, of course, the psychological and emotional patterns. So then, if you look at cancer and addiction as two adaptations to stress, what do we find? Well, prior to my work with addictions, which is my most recent work, and I did that for 12 years, and my book on the subject, I think, is available outside. I worked for 7 years as the coordinator, the medical coordinator of the palliative care unit at Vancouver Hospital, working with terminally ill people. And both in family practice and also in palliative care, I had ample opportunity to see who gets sick and who doesn't get sick. And I noticed that the people that got ill with chronic conditions invariably followed certain emotional behavior dynamics that were ingrained in them, so much so that these were unconscious and compulsive, and for that reason, all the more difficult to let go of. And so that who got cancer and who didn't was no accident, nor was it, for the most part, genetically determined. And I've collected a few clippings from the Globe and Mail newspaper, which is Canada's newspaper of record, or at least it thinks it is. And these clippings illustrate the patterns that I found in people that get sick. And I'm saying all this because in talking about my work with ayahuasca and the potential healing that ayahuasca can induce in people, we have to understand what is being healed here. What is the underlying basis of these conditions? So these newspaper clippings then illustrate something about what I have found in people that get sick chronically. And when I say chronic illness, I mean cancer, I mean diabetes, I mean rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, colitis, Crohn's disease, chronic asthma, psoriasis, eczema, almost any chronic condition you care to name. So the first of these clippings is written by a woman who is herself diagnosed with breast cancer, and she goes to her doctor, Harold, and you have to know that her husband's name is Hai, and Hai's first wife died of breast cancer, and now Donna, the second wife, is diagnosed with the same condition. And so she writes, Harold tells me that the lump is small and most assuredly not in my lymph nodes, unlike that of Hai's first wife, whose cancer spread everywhere by the time they found it. You're not going to die here, he assures me. But I'm worried about Hai, I say. I won't have the strength to support him. Now what do you notice? What you notice is that she's the one diagnosed with a potentially fatal condition, and her automatic and compulsive thought is, all the while that I'm getting chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery, how will I support my husband emotionally? So this automatic regard for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own is a major risk factor for chronic illness. These others are obituaries, and obituaries are fascinating to me because they tell us not only about the people who died, but also about what we as a society value in one another. And often what we value in one another is precisely what kills us. And the expression, the good die young, is not a misstatement. The good do die young because the goodness very often represents a compulsive self-suppression of their own needs. So here's a man, a physician, who dies at age 55 of cancer. An obituary says, never for a day did he contemplate giving up the work he so loved at Toronto Sick Children's Hospital. He carried on with his duties throughout his year-long battle with cancer, stopping only a few days before he died. So if you had a friend who was diagnosed with the same condition, would you say to him or her, hey buddy, here's what you do. You got cancer, go back to work tomorrow. And not for a moment consider your life and the meaning of your life and the stresses that you're generating. Just continue working while you're undergoing chemo, radiation, or surgery. So this automatic and compulsive identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the needs of the self is a major risk factor for chronic illness. The next one. Thank you. But if you're going to applaud every time I say something smart, you'll be applauding the whole afternoon. Okay? Now, the next one, the next obituary is about a woman who dies at age 55 of cancer. Her name is Naomi, and this obituary is written by the appreciative husband. In her entire life, she never got into a fight with anyone. The worst she could say was phooey or something else along those lines. She had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. Now, I'm sure that many of you who are in relationships, sometimes you wish that your partner would blend into the environment in an unassuming manner, but the point is that the suppression of healthy anger that this woman engaged in all her life actually suppresses the immune system. And I'm not going to go into the details of that, but the science of psychoneuroimmunology has amply shown that you can't separate mind from the body, and when you're repressing yourself emotionally, you're actually diminishing the activity of your immune system. And therefore, you're less capable of responding to malignancy or to invasion by bacteria. And again, this idea that external things cause illness. Take a condition like the flesh-eating disease. Necrotizing fasciitis is the medical term. And we think we know the cause. The cause is a bacterium.